Hello again to another Agricolor React. Today we'll be watching Eternally Divided, the animated history of Korea from... I don't know how to pronounce it and I don't want to mispronounce it, so let's just get into it and just watch.
The Winged Hussar pin is available now. Get one before they run out or get one for free by supporting the channel on Patreon. This episode is supported by CuriosityStream, now with a huge 26% off an annual subscription. That's just $14.79, which will also get you free access to my streaming service, Nebula. Sphere of influence. What comes to mind when you hear this term? Perhaps you think of the Cold War between the neoliberal system of the United States and the one-party socialism of the USSR. Or you live in a part of the world once dominated by European colonialism, and to you it means the competition between large foreign powers. Or perhaps you think even older, to the Hellenistic period, where Greek culture would dominate the Middle East from the conquests of Alexander the Great. All these examples are true. If you think about borders in a modern sense, where sovereignty over a piece of land is decided sometimes by an arbitrary line, then influence is anything that passes through that border. This can be military sphere of influence, economic sphere, geopolitical, cultural or social sphere. Heck, even a language can have a sphere of influence. Think of the role English plays in global politics today. Perhaps no place in the world is better suited to study this geopolitical concept than in Korea. Korea has been a land divided by competing spheres for almost its entire history, before you even reach the modern Cold War aftermath that split the peninsula down the middle. The episodes on Japan and China saw Korea coming up quite a lot. Koreans, a relatively homogenous people, are definitely no stranger to outsiders. But this land and its people are far more than just a chapter in somebody else's book. Its culture is rich, its heritage is proud, its contribution to the world of science and technology is perhaps immeasurable at this point. Ask a North Korean today about the history of his people, and he will spin you a tale about a long-forgotten kingdom, resurrected old titles, and 3 famous military generals. Ask a South Korean and he'll probably tell you the same story. So, how did this happen? Korea, much like Japan, became a settled land with the introduction of paddy field agriculture. This was followed by the introduction of bronze weaponry and Korea's first legendary kingdom of Joseon, now called Go-Joseon, meaning Old Joseon. There's a few competing myths about its origin, the most famous of which is a fun story involving heavenly princes, wise Chinese sages, tigers, bears, and garlic, which you should totally look up sometime, dating the kingdom back to 233 BC, which is highly unlikely. But we do know that a state existed in the north as early as the 7th century BC because that's when the Chinese wrote about them. The south though is even less clear, but we do know that a confederacy of city-states did exist called the Jin, but what level of centralized control they had is still debated. The first foundations of a state called Buyo in modern-day Manchuria also existed before the turn of the millennium, but again we aren't sure exactly when it began. And already we can see the beginning of early Chinese influence in the region, with the famous land-hungry Emperor Wu invading and destroying Go-Joseon in 108 BC, fracturing Korea into many tiny states. The Chinese troops were eventually expelled from the north by the newly formed kingdom of Goguryeo, while in the south a distinct identity was forming in the way of the Han. Han is one of the earliest attested names the Koreans had for themselves, and at least somewhat of a kinship is recognized in the 3 confederacies of the Ma-Han, the Jin-Han, and the Byon-Han. And as is so often the case with confederacies, one state would almost always rise up and control the others, and in this case it was Baekje and Shilla. Together with Goguryeo, they formed Korea's enormously famous 3 kingdoms period. Sorry Gaia, you're not included, I guess, because you didn't have a king. Goguryeo was by far the most powerful of these 3 kingdoms, if you couldn't tell by its size. A multi-ethnic, highly militarized and mountainous kingdom that became very powerful with some good old warfare with both the Chinese and the nomads of the steppe. Some of its most famous kings include Sosorim, who helped the north abandon its traditional tribalism in favor of centralized control, as well as Gwantago the Great, who expanded Gogoryo's territory and influence so much that he is widely revered all over Korea today. One of the three famous Korean military leaders, Uluji Munduk, famously defended Goguryeo from an attack by the Sui dynasty in 612, which may have even resulted in the Sui's collapse to the Tang. Baekje, the most fertile and populous of the three, took over most of the west coast and became a massive naval power, both in a military sense but also in a commercial one, linking all of Korea to China and even Japan, helping facilitate the spread of Buddhism throughout the peninsula. So famous, in fact, was its naval trade prowess that it is sometimes called the Phoenicia of the East. If you don't know what Phoenicia is, then I guess you'll just have to wait on an episode on Lebanon. Then we have Sheila, the East Coast Kingdom, the relatively weaker of the three, which grew primarily by diplomacy and kind of just positioning itself as an alternative to the expansion of the other two kingdoms. Now, much of Goguryeo power in the north came from conquering of the old Chinese outposts set up by Emperor Wu centuries earlier. And while China was off busy fighting the nomads, it had quietly tiptoed north, taking more land and plunder while nobody was looking. But China had never really forgotten those outposts, nor their influence in Korea, and once they had mopped up the last of the Gok Turks, they tried invading again, famously failing against the dictator general Yonge Sumun. So it became clear that China would need an ally in Korea if it were to succeed, preferably one with the most to gain. How about Sheila? The Sheila-Tang alliance was a pivotal moment in Korean history. The comparatively smallest and least powerful of the three kingdoms was able to conquer the entire peninsula for the first time in its history with the backing of the huge Tang dynasty. This, of course, means that Chinese influence would return in Korea, even stationing troops in the north. And by all accounts, Chinese rule was pretty brutal, as evidenced by this delightfully named Protectorate General to pacify the north. So, bit of a branding problem.
Yeah.
The Chinese treated the northern Koreans so badly that many sought refuge in the wild and nomadic north in Manchuria, forming the powerful kingdom of Balhae. The Balhae kingdom would eventually fall to those ever-friendly Khitans who established the Liao dynasty, but down south, Sheila was losing its grip on power. Sheila had managed to keep its independence with the backing of the Tang dynasty, but once the Tang fell and were replaced by the Liao, they lost their primary benefactor. The Sheila government relied on a unique form of nepotism called the bone rank system, whereby only a member of sacred bone, the highest level, could be king. Your rank below that determined your status within society, and it was common to be demoted a rank but almost impossible to rise up in one. As you may guess, these kinds of systems don't tend to do well long term because regional aristocracy and peasantry stand nothing to gain by being loyal. So by the end of the rule of Queen Jeonsong, who was either kind-hearted and selfless or immoral and corrupt, depending on which book you read, Baekje and Goryeo broke away from Sheila's control, referred to as the later Three Kingdoms period. You'll see this time and time again in Korean history, by the way, this idea of resurrecting and succeeding a once glorious kingdom from the past, and thus claiming some form of legitimacy to rule. Whoops, don't know how Putin got in here. Goryeo would again return as the most powerful of these three kingdoms, militarily speaking, and after a brief stint of rule with what was likely to be the cruel and ruthless Buddhist extremist Gangya, power was usurped by King Taizhou, who managed to again reunite the peninsula, capping off this monumental task by marrying 29 prominent women from the noble families throughout his whole domain to foster loyalty.
29?
Yeesh, and I thought the Habsburgs were bad. The Goryeo dynasty is considered to be Korea's intellectual and cultural golden age. Its scholars and engineers were well regarded all over Asia. Its military prowess was famous, as was one of its generals, Gangam Chun, who defended the nation from the Liao dynasty by flooding their army in a river. And for this, he is remembered as the second great general of Korean history. So prosperous, in fact, was the Goryeo dynasty that it kind of painted a target on its back with the arrival of the Mongols. In the previous episode, we talked about how pretty much every nation in Asia has some pivotal changing point in its history caused by the Mongol invasions. Because of the speed and brutality, they upended centuries of political and economic institutions in the comparative blink of an eye. And this is no different in Goryeo, but the Koreans didn't give them an easy time by any means. Much of the civilian peasantry took an active role in hostility to the invading hordes, forming bands of militias called righteous armies. These righteous armies had been used on a smaller scale even before the Mongols and would play a key role in resistance to every outside invasion for centuries to come. Guerrilla warfare and rebellions were widespread, even after the nation's scholars usurped power from the Choi military clan and signed Korea over as a vassal to the Yuan dynasty. In hindsight though, this was probably to their benefit since they managed to quietly slip away without too much trouble during the Red Turban rebellions. But for some reason, this seemed like the perfect opportunity for a prominent general, Yi Sung-gye, to rebel and take over Korea, once again reviving an old Korean name, this time Joseon, to give himself more legitimacy. So, just to keep track, we've now had 3 Goryos, 2 Baekjes, 3 Shilas, and 2 Joseons, just to make things perfectly confusing. Now, although most of Korea's culture and identity can be attributed to Goryeo, the Joseon dynasty is really where it solidified. It was both the longest lasting and most culturally enduring of the Korean kingdoms, lasting more than 5 centuries with some of the nation's most famous accomplishments, such as the law reforms and the development of the brand new Hangul script by Sejong the Great. Hangul, widely considered to be one of the best writing systems, was developed to match the sounds of human speech, regardless of a change in pronunciation over time, and theoretically it can be used to write any language in the world. There is a movement within linguistics to make this script the universal writing system for all the world's languages, by the way, and I am absolutely on board with that. But regardless of its golden age, Joseon still found itself battling against the influence of its neighbors, particularly China, with whom the Joseon had agreed to be in a tributary relationship to lend some more legitimacy, but also with the rising power of Japan. You'll remember from that episode that Toyotomi Hideyoshi had recently united the islands and was eager to send the samurai somewhere else before they could revolt against his rule, and so he decided to invade Korea. Although they were winning on land, this invasion was kind of catastrophic for the Japanese Navy, thanks to the excellent tactics of Korea's third famous commander, Admiral Yi Sun-sin, who, although he had no naval training, never lost a single battle against the Japanese, with his amazing Gyobason, or turtle ships, arguably the first armored naval vessels ever developed. This war was also noteworthy to be the first widespread use of gunpowder in Asia, the Koreans battling the samurai with hand cannons, arquebuses, and a uniquely powerful Korean invention called the hwacha, capable of firing hundreds of rocket-powered arrows at once. This, coupled with extraordinary help from the Ming Dynasty, is ultimately what saved Korea. Oh, would you look at the clock, it's Manchu time. The Manchus, or Jurchens, were a semi-nomadic ethnic group that had been raiding China and Korea for centuries, and they just so happened to have recently unified under Khan Narachi and are invading the Ming Dynasty. This put Korea in a bit of an awkward position, choosing to side with the Ming, whom they owed for their help against the Japanese, resulting in the Manchu invasions of themselves. Much like the Chinese, the Koreans viewed the Manchus of the Qing Dynasty with indignation, thinking of them nothing more than outsiders and barbarians. Joseon society is also famous for its state ideology, Neo-Confucianism, and much like Japan, which had its underground enlightenment during this period, the Joseon would see a rise in a social reform movement built on criticism of those principles, in response to an increasingly modern and changing world, called Silhak, as well as a more Korean-centric re-evaluation of its own history. Politically, the Joseon became divided in the 19th century by different interpretations of Silhak ideas, and in the meantime the monarchy was becoming extremely corrupt with its own problems, primarily due to issues with the Sedo system, which kept power in the hands of the king's in-laws from the Andong Kim family rather than the king, and they became stubborn, isolationist and fiercely anti-Christian too, especially when a European presence became more common after the Opium Wars. The Joseon managed to fend off an attack by the French in 1866 and the Americans in 1871, but something tells me the Americans will be back soon enough. But for now, as China weakened, a new sphere of influence would begin to raise its ugly head. Japan. Unlike most of Asia at the time, Japan had seen the writing on the wall in terms of the dangers posed by European imperialism, and decided that the only way to ensure she didn't become like China was to expand her own sphere of influence. The Qing dynasty and the Empire of Japan fought on Korean soil for Korean influence, chaotically bringing an end to the 500-year-old kingdom and bringing the Empire of Korea under Japanese protection. At least, that's how the Japanese saw it. We are rapidly approaching a very messy time in Korea's story, as is so often the case with this period, where sphere of influence starts to mean nothing but misery and death for most Koreans. Under the forced annexation by Japan in 1910, Korea's righteous armies would again rebel, brutally suppressed by their Japanese rulers. Korean language and culture was discouraged, women were tricked or forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese armies, called comfort women, a topic so traumatizing that its mere mention in Korea or Japan today is taboo. Thousands of Koreans were conscripted into the losing war with the Allies in 1944, and millions were forcibly moved to Japan to work in horrendous conditions to support the war effort, and up to 500,000 Koreans are estimated to have died in the conflict. As horrific and devastating as the Second World War was, it was the expanding spheres of influence of the USA and the USSR that would result in most of the death on this peninsula. Similar to the occupation zone set up in Germany, the Soviets and the Americans divided the Korean peninsula along the 38th parallel in 1945. The UN had planned for the entire peninsula to have a free and fair election, but the Soviets and the Americans, each extremely paranoid about the influence of the other, would install two of Korea's most brutal dictators in two separate regimes, each loyal to the other side. Kim Il-sung, a radical communist who had lived most of his life in China and the Soviet Union, consolidated and swept elections in the north. And in the south, things weren't much better. The Americans favored the first president of the Provisional Korean Government, Syngman Rhee, an extreme authoritarian who was deeply corrupt and fiercely anti-communist. Corrupt and anti-communist, just like America. Both claimed the right to rule the whole of Korea, and both were backed by competing world powers and fundamentally different ideologies. It's not hard to see what would come next. The North set up a military dictatorship regime far from anything either Karl Marx or even arguably Lenin would have recognized as socialist, and in 1950 it invaded the South. The Korean War had begun. This war was a first in a series of a brand new kind of conflict, a proxy war between the two dominant world superpowers and their allies on the soil of a foreign nation, and it would not be the last. A UN coalition led by the US joined the South, nearly defeating Kim's army, before more than 1 million Chinese troops crossed the border to aid the North, eventually resulting in a stalemate. This is what proxy conflict means. The spheres of influence these nations were fighting for result in a very strange fact where the overwhelming majority of troops who fought in the Korean War for the North Koreans in North Korea were Chinese. The North and the South committed numerous atrocities during this war. 700,000 Korean soldiers lost their lives, 200,000 Chinese, 36,000 Americans, 3 million civilians due to starvation and crimes against humanity, all in the relentless pursuit of geopolitical games and ideological dominance. Both sides to this day continue to hold up these brutal atrocities as justification for continued hostilities. South Korea over time has managed to reform itself and has broken down and rebuilt itself and its institutions several times to reach the modern, prosperous and democratic state we see today. But the situation in North Korea couldn't be any more different. The nominally socialist but de facto totalitarian dictatorship eventually went somewhat rogue along the way, establishing a cult of personality around the Kim family that even a tyrant like Stalin could have only dreamed about. Mandating extreme isolationism, deification of its rulers, state-sanctioned media producing propaganda the likes of which we'll probably never know the full extent of. The nation has lagged decades behind its southern counterpart, all the while committing itself to its destruction, and in particular too of American imperialism. North Korea is often the butt of some jokes. Its media and army are lampooned all over the internet, but we should remember that the North Korean people are living in a special kind of hell, and nobody in the world will lift a finger to aid them because they don't stand anything to gain. Except for maybe China, but they probably wouldn't be motivated by the kindness of their hearts. This is what sphere of influence means to Korea. It is the interference by outsiders. Korea has arguably been in one nation's zone of influence or another's for almost its entire recorded history, and the story has been the same, whether it be the Chinese, the Mongols, the Manchurians, the Japanese, the Soviets, the Americans, the neoliberals, or the communists. We still see those marks today. This land is not united, and possibly may never be again. I don't know. I can only hope I'm wrong. If you'd like to learn more about spheres of influence and the Cold War's proxy conflicts, then I highly recommend checking out this excellent episode of The Butterfly Effect on CuriosityStream. which takes a look at several overlapping phases, both within the collapse of traditional European colonialism and the rise of the conflict that would eventually result in the Vietnam War, the arguably most famous Cold War proxy conflict. CuriosityStream has recently expanded their library with thousands of titles, with documentaries on history, society, science, physics, and tons more to satiate your curiosity. And they're running a special at the moment where you can get a huge 26% off an annual subscription if you sign up at the link.
This is from 2021, so that this is not valid anymore. And thinking about Korea is just, yeah, I wonder. Hopefully he's not right and they're gonna be reunited sometime, but then doesn't look like it, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.